Welcome our speaker tonight, Dave.
My name's Dave. I'm an alcoholic. It's a privilege and an honor to speak, and Chris called me a couple hours ago and asked if I would speak, and I noticed a little trepidation, waiting for me to say maybe no, but I couldn't imagine saying no. I could not imagine saying no. Because I do everything for effect, and that's what got me here, because I was all about doing things for effect. If it made me feel good, I did it. I'm supposed to share what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now. And what it was like is I was just a kid that enjoyed riding my bike and lighting garbage cans on fire and, doing all the kinds of derelict stuff that kids do. And I can think back and, remember the parents having fights and, not doing my chores and getting punished and getting thrown around. But it wasn't a bad childhood. Because when I got here, I wanted to start looking back and like trying to explain why I was an alcoholic and whose fault it was and what the reason was, because I was one that always wanted to make sense of stuff, and I've yet to be able to make sense of why I became an alcoholic. God knows I've been to enough therapy and enough retreats and done enough self-exploration that if there was an answer that was easy for me to come by, I'd have figured it out. But, I'm 51 now. I've been sober since October 6th of 93. And I'm just now starting to realize that I'm probably never going to figure out exactly why I became an alcoholic, like what one thing it was. And for so many years, I wanted to blame it, because I thought if I could fix that, then I'd be okay. And that takes me to the beginning of, I think why I was seeking escape from life, because I just did not feel okay. I don't know if anyone really feels okay, because there's part of me that wants to kind of compare myself to the collective community, my other schoolmates, my other siblings, to just get some sense of understanding and connection to this community. I still struggle with that. And I think the older I get, the closer I get to really trying to understand that there's just going to be days that are rough where I just don't feel okay. But when I was a kid, that happened a lot. And, I can remember thinking, maybe if I smoke cigarettes, and I was too young to buy cigarettes, so I remember I got like a piece of notebook paper and I got some like mulberry leaves and I tried to put them in there. And it's just, who does that kind of shit? But some little kid who's a little bit maladjusted and just trying to fit in and feel okay, and then going through the herb cabinet, like smoking cloves and smoking all the different spices that Mom had. For who knows what reason, but it was something to do, and it was something that was a little bit, you're not supposed to do that stuff. And so when there was something you weren't supposed to do, I was always the one that tried it. I was that kid in high school whose parents said, hey, I don't want my kids hanging out with that kid. And I was that kid because I was the one that just, did shit for effect, for a thrill. Like I remember one time I left a party and I was drinking Corona long necks. I had limes. It was really fancy for, high school. I had a cooler full of beer, and some of my buddies were going to the store to do a beer run, and I go, I'll go. Like, I had all the beer I'd need that night. Why would I go do a beer run? For effect. Because it would get me that rush. And what do you know? We did the beer run, and no sooner did the tires hit the main road out of Circle K that there was a cop behind us. Yeah, right? And I'm like, why do I do this shit? And, my parents picked me up, and they're like, yeah, the officer said you had a marijuana pipe in your pocket. I'm like, because I'd do anything. And they said, is there a problem with that? And I'm like, no, there's no problem. I smoke pot. Like, it's just what I do. But that was at the time in my life where my parents didn't know what to do with me. And they would just get fed up and they'd say, we give up. And I'd be like, thank God. And so then a few days later, they'd be on my back, and I'd look at them straight, square in the face, and I'd say, I thought you gave up yesterday. And I was a rough kid, you know. But I wasn't a bad kid. I just liked to get high and get drunk, and you know, whatever you had, I was going to do. And thank God, the people I ran with never did IV drugs, because I have been an IV drug user, and that could have killed me. But the only reason I didn't do it was not because of my self-control, or not because, you know, I was a purist, because I was not a purist in any sense of the word. I would do anything you had, anything I could find. And if I'd made a rule about not doing it, I would make an exception the minute it came in front of me. I'd be like, oh, I guess we're doing it tonight. But I'm grateful that I never did heroin, because I've just heard the stories about heroin, you know, because I think I would have really loved that. And fast forward, I had some issues with an ex-wife and the judge, and I woke up at like 2 in the morning, and I'm thinking, I needed to fucking do heroin. That's what I need to do. And I was sober like 20 years. And that was the first thing on my mind. And so that's proof to me that the disease is alive and well in my brain. All I get is a daily reprieve based on the maintenance of my spiritual condition. And for the new guy, welcome. Do you have a big book? Me? You don't have a big book? And I do that, Jimmy, because I want you to make it, right? And when I got in here, I was this small, right? I was scared to park my truck because I didn't know what I was going to find in here. I was scared to come in here. I was scared to speak up, to do anything. I was full of fear. And I shook your hand on the way in. Do you think that's ironic? Is that odd, or is that God? Right? And when I have those moments and I shook your hand and I caught your eyes, the two new guys, Pedro, right? Welcome. You guys are in the right place, and you're sitting in the best seats in the house. You're in the front row. Like, that's admirable. And my first speaker, when I got in here, he had like 3 things. He said, you sit in the front, you thank the speaker, and you reach out to the newcomer. I still try to do that today. But I'll go back to what it was like. And thanks for being willing to step up and get that, Jimmy. That takes courage. And that's all it takes to get sober, right? Courageous. And you know, when I was a kid, when I was running and gunning, I had no courage. I was scared of everything all the time. Liquid courage, you know, got me in trouble, got me in jail, got me in fights, got me busted for, you know, vandalism and just doing messed up stuff. But when I got here, I was not in a good way, you know, and there was a progression, a downward progression until I got here. But I remember one night, we did so much of a certain drug that makes you go real fast that in the morning, I thought for sure that I'd done brain damage. And so I was literally looking through the encyclopedias to see if I could find out if this drug would give me brain damage, because I felt like I really cooked my brain the night before. And with every drink and drug, you know, I know that I did a little bit of brain damage, but I didn't know anything else to do because I was constantly in a state of misery. I was always uncomfortable. You know, when I first got here, right before I got here, I was seeing a therapist because I thought that was a problem I needed to get educated on because I had problems with women. So I went to see, took a class about male and female communication, and then I took another one on stress management at GCC, and I thought maybe education's the answer, right? Maybe I could fix my brain with education. And one of the instructors ended up being a therapist, and I ended up seeing her as soon as the class ended. And I remember asking me, what do you want? And I said, man, I just want to be comfortable. And that's it. I just wanted to be comfortable in my own skin and not be stressed, not be anxious, not be fearful, not be paranoid, you know, and not have that just tension all the time, just a vice around my chest. And I'll never forget that because that's really what I wanted. And, that's what I found in AA for moments. Comfort, to be comfortable. And it definitely did not come when I first went to my first meeting. I got shipped out to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina for 2 weeks to dry out. And I was a mess. And I about screwed that up 2 days into it because they really started squeezing me. And when I say getting squeezed, that's when they're starting to put the pressure on me. I haven't had any, drink or drug for about 48 hours, and I'm starting to get really uncomfortable. And they just kept asking the questions and pressing on me, and I lost it. Like, I raged. Walked out of the room, and it was like a 2-week therapy intensive, and I walked out of the room. And I remember sitting on the edge of the bed thinking, I'm screwed, man. That was my one chance at a different life. And I just alienated all those people. I showed them my true colors. And that's not even the half of it. And the option was to get on the plane and go back home and go back to the misery that I'd left. And I was like, I didn't know what to do. And I always talk about I had this ball that was like at my throat, and I felt like it was getting bigger and my head was going to explode because I had so much anxiety and so much pent-up emotion and rage and sadness and everything you could have imagined. It was right there, and my head was going to go flying, and that probably would have been the easier, softer way, but it wasn't going to happen. And I'd been there many times before, and that's always why I went back to the drink and the drug, because I got so uncomfortable feeling whatever I was feeling because I didn't know how to do feelings. And I'm sitting on the edge of the bed, and it seemed like for hours, and my mind is just racing. And this guy comes in and sits next to me, and he says, hey, you going to come back in? Thought that's what I got to do, and I went back in that room, and everyone that I just raged on and alienated on was on the opposite side of the room. And once again, I was all alone, which is how I always felt, and it was like a self-fulfilling prophecy. But something happened, something happened in that 2-week program. And I got honest, and I got in touch with just a little bit of what was going on underneath. They say drinking and alcohol and drugs are but a symptom, right? So when you take away the drugs and the alcohol, I don't get better, I get worse real fast. And so in that 2-week program, they helped me deal with that getting worse real fast, what was kind of causing all of that stuff. And so after that 2-week program, I had just a little bit of hope, just a little bit of serenity, and I felt just a little bit lighter, right? I could have a smile on my face that felt just a little bit sincere, like I felt, like I'm going to be okay. Because normally when I'd smile, it was fake, and people could see right through it, like I was miserable to the core. And so after that 2 weeks, everyone was shaking my hand, and they weren't afraid of me anymore. And because I'd been vulnerable and I'd really shown my true side. And it's set up for me to come home. They told my mom, don't go to the house, take him directly to the 3-quarter house. And I stayed at Crossroads down in Phoenix for 6 months. And when I walked into Crossroads, that was the beginning of the rest of the beginning of this new life, sober. And the guy, when I walked in, he said, how long are you staying? And no one had asked me much of anything about what I was doing for a long time. And I'm like, fuck, I better answer this right. Because at that point, I was on a high. My life had turned around and my life was going good. And I didn't want to make the wrong answer because I didn't know how long I was supposed to stay. And so I took a risk. And I said, I don't know. How long do guys that make it stay? Because at that point, I think I'd realized that I was done running my life. Like, I did not know what to do, and I didn't want to screw it up anymore because I was on a new path. And I knew that, right? Like, my heart had been changed. And he said, well, how about 6 months? And I said, sign me up. 6 months, and I never looked back. And I did what they told me to do. They're like, you need to go to 2 house meetings, and you need to do this, and you got chores, and you got dishes for 2 weeks. And this is dishes not for just the house guys. This is dishes for probably 150, 200 people a day that they feed at Crossroads. And so you're in there doing dishes for 3-4 hours a night. And some guys would go back out and they'd be like, I'm not doing fucking dishes. I'm too good for that. And I'd watch them go out and I'd be like, hey, sign me up, man. I'm doing the dishes. Because at least when I was doing the dishes, I knew that I was investing in something that was going to, so they said, keep me sober. I'd heard that going to meetings, washing the coffee pots and washing the coffee cups and doing all this kind of stuff. It's all about service. And so I was beaten into a sense of reasonableness when I got here in the program. And I went to all the meetings I could. I remember I went to a candlelight meeting one night, and it was just so amazing. They shut all the lights down. And it was like I started to feel a little more comfortable than I'd felt in regular meetings because I couldn't see anyone's face because it was dark. And I remember, I couldn't wait to get back to the halfway house and tell all the guys about this new meeting I'd found. And so then the next week, I was like recruiting guys to go to this candlelight meeting. And it was the coolest freaking thing because that was my first time realizing that I had something to share. Like I'd found something that worked for me. And I was like, man, you guys got to try this. And I remember when I started doing that, I'm like, oh, that's what they mean about giving it away. And I think I was sober maybe 2 months. And so I realized, I picked up on things early on in this program that I would do that made me feel better. And if it didn't produce a feeling, I wouldn't believe it. But I've yet to have anyone in AA tell me to do something that they shared from their experience like they had done it, right? They weren't just telling me because it was something they read out of a book or something they learned. It's because it was something they had done. And so they told me I needed to get a sponsor. And I was like, man, okay, but that's going to be rough because that's really me forfeiting me being the one to run my own life and run the show and say, okay, I'm going to take direction from someone else. I'm going to ask someone else how this works. And I had mentioned to a couple guys in the house that I was going to get a sponsor at this Tuesday night meeting. And I was trying to muster the courage because I'm still a fear-driven person. I'm still full of fear. And so I would kind of tell these guys, yeah, I'm going to get a sponsor to try and get that courage to go get a sponsor. And so we went to the Tuesday night meeting. And after the Tuesday night meeting ended, all of a sudden I lost that courage to get a sponsor. And I'm starting to walk back out the back door, and those two guys were waiting at the door, and they said, hey, you said you were going to get a sponsor. Go get a sponsor. And I'm like, man. And so I went back up to the front, and I'll never forget, there was this guy, Charlie and Jim. Jim was the chairperson, and Charlie was like the secretary or something. And I said, Jim, do you have like a list of sponsors? And he looked at me kind of funny, and he goes, no. A little condescending. And he looks over, he goes, but I bet Charlie would sponsor you. And so I said, okay. And so I got Charlie's number, and Charlie was my sponsor. And I chased him through the steps, and it worked. And I guess that's the thing about, AA is there's no one way to do this thing. There's not. And there's a lot of people in here that are going to tell you that their way is the way. But I'm the type of person that likes to do it my way. And it's not always the easy way. I've struggled a lot. I mean, this past year has been super rough for me. Like my ass literally fell off. But the one thing I didn't quit doing, I didn't quit reaching out and asking for help. I think I was sober 27 years before I really was put in a place where I didn't know if I was going to live or die. Honest to God. And the crazy thing is I never once thought about drinking or drugging through that time. But as my buddy Joel says, the first thing is I tend to isolate myself from my community, right? I quit going to meetings. I quit trusting people. I revert back to the person I was when I got here, because when I got here, I didn't trust anyone, because anyone I ever trusted turned their back on me. And so I just made a pact with me and myself that I wasn't going to trust anyone. And so that's what my disease wants. It wants me isolated. And then it starts talking to me, telling me things. And next thing I know, blowing the back of my head off sounds like a pretty good idea, a pretty good solution. And I've been there a few times in sobriety, but that's where I was when I got here. I was super depressed in just a horrible state of despair and suicidal. And I thought probably 100 times a day about how I was going to kill myself, And so when I get into a really rough spot, that's where I go. And I've been in that spot in the past year. And, I can't tell you why. And I've really quit trying to figure out why. I just look out in front and try to remember what they told me to do when I got here, and that's get out of myself, pick up that phone that they joke about it weighs 1,000 pounds. But at one point, I was in really a rough spot, and I'd get up in the morning and I'd listen to some guy on YouTube for about 3 or 4 hours, and I'd muster enough, I don't even know what, because it wasn't courage, enough desire to just get out of bed, and I'd get on the phone and be on the phone talking for 3 or 4 hours until about 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And that was about when the voices in my head would stop, when the depression would just let up a little bit, and when I'd feel like, okay, I'm going to be able to breathe today. I'm going to be able to make it through today. And I think that's the biggest thing I've learned about sobriety is, I never get there. I heard a speaker one time that used to talk about the pronouns in an alcoholic's brain. I want to meet her, not just any her, but capital her, the one that is top of all hers. And when I have her, I'll have found it. Not just any it, but I'll be, doing good, her and it. And when I find her and I have it, then I'll be there. And it just resonated with me when he said that. I'm like, I get it. And my brain still wants to think that's how it is, but that's not how it is for me. And I can't speak for any of you guys, but I can just speak for me. And so today, I've been doing a morning routine that's a new morning routine, only because my ass literally fell off, and I started calling this guy named Bill. I call him Wise Bill, Bill K. I used to sit in meetings with him at Bill's Pizza in Prescott. But I called him because I was really having a rough time, and I'm like telling about what's going on. And he asked me a question. He goes, Dave, so what about God? Silent. I'm embarrassed, but not ashamed. I said, Bill, I don't know, man. It's been rough, and I've been, running and looking and trying to figure and doing and being busy, and he just listened. And then I had to go, and so I hung up. And I called him back a couple hours later, and he gave me some readings in the big book. I've been doing those readings every morning since I talked to him like 2 months ago. Every morning. And I'm afraid to not do those readings every morning because my life has started to get better from what it was. And it was in a bad way. It was in a bad way. And then I've added a morning journaling routine to that called my Future Self Journal. And I picked that up from a book that I've read. And I've just become a ravenous reader, but I don't read so good, so I listen to them on Audible. A ravenous listener, let me rephrase that. But I just look for things that engage my sober mind, things that point my brain to the solution. And the crazy part is that I honestly can't remember most of what I've listened to, but it helps me to pass the time and get my mind quiet. And if I just remember like 1 or 2 things from a whole book, or if I take away 1 or 2 new behaviors from whatever I gleaned it from, that's how I'm combating my disease of alcoholism. And I've realized that I'm never going to be cured. I'm never safe because the disease is alive and well in the back of my head. And as long as I'm not feeding sobriety, that disease is doing push-ups and it's getting stronger. And it's not going to let up until it kills me. And that'll be until I take my last breath, And I work with patients in end of life now, and a lot of people talk about, well, if I got a terminal illness, I just drink, and I had to ask myself, if I got a terminal illness, would I just drink and tie that last one on? I wouldn't want to, because then I'd miss out, And I think the big thing I'm learning with my struggles is that they're showing me a different way. They're bringing me to my knees, and I'm being humbled before, God and all of you. And I'm here to say that, there's no reason to take a drink no matter what. because I know that nothing going on in my life as a drink or a drug is going to make any better. I mean, it just won't. All of a sudden I'm getting nervous and I'm getting sweaty and I'm like, fuck, I'm running out of stuff to say and it's early, but that's okay. You know, I mean, I come up here and I do my best, and if I don't fill the whole 50 minutes, so be it, you know. And so that's all I've got, and I'm going to cut it short tonight, and with that, I will pass.